The sun glinted off the surface of the water, a shimmering living mirror reflecting the bright blue sky. It was a perfect scene, a tranquility I had spent 3 grueling years earning. My name is Alex, and this, all of this, was my lake. Not just the property surrounding it, not just the cabin nestled in the trees, the actual lake itself. Every single drop of water, every inch of the mud bottom, belonged to me. It was a detail that had been overlooked, forgotten, or perhaps simply ignored for decades, until I came along. My journey here began with a simple craving for peace, a retreat from the soul-crushing uniformity of city life. I had been looking for a place with character, a project, something where I could put my hands to work and see tangible results. That's how I stumbled upon the listing for Lot 47, distressed waterfront property. Distressed was an understatement. What the listing called a private lake was, in reality, a mucky, choked-out swamp. The surrounding community, a cluster of relatively upscale homes built in the late 80s, had essentially abandoned it. Their houses faced the other direction, toward the manicured community park and pool. The lake was in the back, a neglected eyesore they pretended didn't exist. It was full of invasive water hyacinth, silted up so badly that the deepest point was barely 4 feet, and the banks were a riot of poison ivy and dying willow trees. The price, thankfully, reflected the monumental task ahead. I bought it for a song, a literal fraction of what a viable waterfront property should cost. The closing was painless, mostly because the title company barely wanted to deal with it. They handed me the deed for the land, and more importantly, the deed that explicitly included the submerged land rights and water access rights for the entire body of water historically known as Lake Serenity. My ownership was absolute. The restoration was my passion project, a labor of love that nearly broke me financially and physically. The first 6 months were a nightmare of machinery and mud. I hired a specialized dredging company to clear the silt. It cost a fortune, but it was necessary. We hauled out truckload after truckload of decades of accumulated sediment, deepening the lake to a healthy 10 to 12 feet in most places. The water quality immediately began to improve. Next came the battle against the invasive plants. I spent countless weekends in waders pulling out masses of hyacinth by hand and treating the remaining patches with eco-friendly herbicides. I consulted with an environmental specialist to reintroduce native plant species along the banks to stabilize the soil and create a healthy ecosystem. I brought in 3,000 fingerlings bass, bluegill and catfish to re-establish a thriving fishery. I replaced the crumbling, rotting little dock that came with the property with a solid, beautiful wooden pier. I cleared a small trail around my portion of the bank, planted a vegetable garden, and finally, started to relax. 2 years turned into 3. The lake was no longer a swamp, it was a jewel. The water was clear, the banks were green and lush with life, and you could hear the plop of fish jumping on warm summer evenings. Neighbors from the surrounding community, who previously wouldn't have dared walk within 50 yards of the place, started taking notice. I saw them on the adjacent public trail, pointing, sometimes taking pictures. They were suddenly interested in the beautiful new lake that had appeared out of nowhere. I'd wave, sometimes chat briefly. They were always polite, commenting on my incredible work. Everything was perfect. That perfection lasted until a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I was staining the planks of my new pier, the scent of fresh pine and oil mixing with the clean, earthy smell of the lake air, when a shiny black SUV pulled up onto my dirt road. 3 people emerged, dressed in clothes that looked utterly ridiculous for the environment: khaki slacks, crisp button-down shirts, and 2 of them wore matching, ridiculously oversized lanyards. The woman in the center, who clearly considered herself the leader, had an expression fixed somewhere between patronizing disapproval and aggressive entitlement. She was carrying a laminated clipboard. "Good afternoon," she announced, her voice too loud and sharp for the peaceful setting. She didn't wait for me to reply. "I'm Carol, the current president of the Pinnacle Ridge Homeowners Association. These are Mark and Susan, also on the board." I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Alex, can I help you?" Carol's eyes scanned the lake, momentarily softening with grudging admiration, before snapping back to professional severity. "Yes, Alex, we're here to discuss the outstanding dues and compliance issues regarding Lake Serenity." I paused, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't follow. Dues for what? I don't live in the Pinnacle Ridge development. I bought this lot and the lake separately. And it's outside your HOA boundaries." I had checked this, obsessively, before closing the deal. My property was an anomaly, a piece of land explicitly excluded from the covenants. Carol gave me a tight, pitying smile. "That's a common misconception, dear. While your cabin is technically outside the immediate boundary, Lake Serenity itself, as a shared amenity and common resource, has always been under the jurisdiction of the HOA for maintenance and preservation, as outlined in the original founding documents." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Maintenance and preservation. They had let it rot for 30 years. With all due respect, Carol, that's news to me. I have the deed. I own this lake. I bought the submerged land. I'm the one who paid 6 figures to dredge it and restore the ecosystem. What maintenance are you referring to? Mark, the man next to her, finally spoke, adjusting his glasses. The potential for maintenance, Alex, and the access. The lake is a focal point of the community. We've decided, now that it's presentable again, that all residents bordering the historical boundary, or deriving benefit from the common area, must contribute to the amenity fund. Deriving benefit, I echoed, trying to keep the incredulity out of my voice. The only person deriving benefit is me, and the fish, who no longer have to live in a mud puddle, and the only person who paid for it is me. I gestured to the pristine water. I restored this lake. You're welcome for the incredible view and the increase in your property values, but you don't own it. The deed is clear. Carol leaned forward slightly, adopting the tone of a teacher addressing a slow student. Alex, we understand you did some work, but the truth is, the lake's purpose is to serve the community. The HOA's legal counsel has reviewed the plats. Even if you own the land beneath the water itself is a shared resource. We are asserting our rights to govern the body of water. We're offering you a chance to be a responsible community member by paying the quarterly dues, which, by the way, have retroactively been applied for the last 12 months. Retroactive dues, I laughed, a short, sharp bark that startled a heron on the far bank. You want me to pay for a lake you ignored for 30 years, and then pay you for the year I spent fixing your neglect? You have got to be kidding me. It's $850 per quarter, Alex, plus a one-time assessment of $3,400 for what we're calling the amenity beautification fee, which covers the increased value we'll all benefit from. Susan chimed in sweetly, holding up the clipboard. We expect payment in full within 30 days, or we'll be forced to file a lien against your property. This was it. The moment where my idyllic retreat turned into an HOA nightmare. They stood there, the three of them, smug and certain, convinced they had the authority to simply co-opt my massive investment. They had seen the beautiful lake, realized it was a valuable asset, and decided to strong-arm the single owner who had created it. What they failed to grasp, what they could unpossibly know because they had unbothered to read the documents they claimed gave them power, was the meticulous legal planning I had done from the start. Carol, I said, my voice dropping, suddenly calm. I looked her right in the eye. Let me be extremely clear. You are standing on my private property. Every inch of this water and the land it rests on is mine. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here, and you have no legal basis to demand a single cent from me. I bought this lake with the intention of owning it completely, and I made damn sure the title was free and clear of any HOA covenants before I signed a single paper. In fact, my attorney specifically found the exclusion clauses. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy. I have the deed right inside the cabin. I can show you the section that explicitly states Lot 47, which includes the entirety of Lake Serenity, is not a common area and is not subject to the HOA SCC and RS. You were probably hoping I was some gullible newcomer. But you picked the wrong person. Carol's face didn't falter, but the edge of her smile started to twitch. That's simply your interpretation, Alex. Our interpretation is different. We have a community to protect, and access to this beautiful body of water is vital to property values. We're happy to move forward with the necessary legal steps to clarify ownership and establish the proper usage easements for all members. Usage easements, I repeated, my voice now laced with steel. Let me tell you something, Carol. If you take one step toward filing a lien, or if any HOA member attempts to access this lake, launches a canoe, drops a fishing line, or even dips a tide, we'll call the sheriff and I will press criminal trespass charges. Furthermore, if you force me into a legal fight, I won't just fight your lien. I will use the full extent of my private property rights to ensure that no one in your entire community can ever look at this lake again. I picked up the can of stain and a brush, returning to my work, deliberately turning my back on them. You're trespassing, all three of you. The discussion is over. You have 5 minutes to get off my property before I have to call the non-emergency line to report a disturbance. The silence behind me was profound. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. After about 90 seconds of tense stillness, I heard the faint rustle of their expensive clothing and the crunch of gravel as they retreated. I didn't turn around until the sound of the black SUV's engine faded in the distance. They had shown their hand, an attempt at a quick, cheap land grab, relying on intimidation. But they had made a mistake. They thought they were dealing with an ordinary homeowner. They had no idea they were dealing with a sole, determined, and legally prepared owner of every single drop of their lake. The battle had officially begun, and I had the water rights to prove I was holding all the cards. I knew this was only the beginning of their harassment, but I was ready. I'd spent 3 years restoring a lake. I wasn't about to let 3 self-important busybodies destroy my peace now. The only thing they were going to get from me was a very expensive lesson in property law. The first part of the script ends here, poised for the escalation of the conflict. The black SUV, carrying Carol, Mark, and Susan, the self-appointed triumvirate of the Pinnacle Ridge HOA, had barely disappeared around the bend when the electronic harassment began. I was cleaning my tools, trying to wash the aggression out of my hands, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was simply listed as Pinnacle Ridge HOA Legal. The subject line, stark and aggressive. Read, Notice of assessment and intent to file lien, Lake Serenity amenity. I opened it, my blood pressure rising immediately. Attached were 2 PDFs. The first was an invoice, $3,400 for the amenity beautification fee and $850 for the first quarter. Community resource dues, all due in 30 days. Beneath the total was a line item labeled delinquency processing fee, $150, because naturally they had managed to find me before the first bill was even due. They were operating on a timeline of pure petty aggression. The second document was the real threat, a formal legally dense letter from an obscure local law firm retained by the HOA. The letter laid out their interpretation of the property rights, which was a masterful blend of wishful thinking and selective citation. They claimed that while my deed granted me ownership of the submerged land, the actual dirt beneath the water itself, Lake Serenity, fell under the state's riparian rights doctrine regarding non-navigable private lakes that border multiple properties. They asserted that since the lake technically touched the boundary lines of several lots within the Pinnacle Ridge Plat, it was thus a shared natural resource that the HOA was legally obligated to maintain and govern to ensure equitable use and environmental stability for the entire community. The key sentence highlighted in bold in their letter was a threat. Failure to satisfy the outstanding financial obligations will result in the immediate placement of a lien on the property, described as Lot 47 and any associated structures pursuant to Article 5 of the Pinnacle Ridge Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions CC&Rs. They were using the brute force tactic HOAs use best, threatening the title to my home. They wanted to force me to either pay or hire an expensive attorney just to prevent a cloud on my title. I didn't panic. I just got methodical. I grabbed the stack of documents that had been the foundation of my entire purchase, the original deed, the title insurance policy, and the 1980s era county plat map that had explicitly carved my lot out of the HOA's territory. My initial response was not to the HOA but to my attorney, James. I forwarded the entire email chain with a succinct note. They showed up today and followed up with this: execute Plan B. Plan B was simple. A preemptive, ironclad response to shut down their legal claim before they could even file the paperwork for the lien. James was a land use shark, and he had been paid extra 2 years ago specifically to bulletproof my purchase against this exact scenario. The next day, the HOA escalated beyond emails. They showed up physically again, but this time they didn't come to my cabin. I was enjoying a quiet morning coffee on the dock I'd painstakingly stained, watching the base break the surface, when I heard the unmistakable noise of an engine. Not a boat engine, a small, loud, sputtering utility engine. I walked to the edge of my property line on the far side of the lake, peering through the trees. A couple hundred feet away, in a small, unused strip of municipal land that technically bordered the lake but not my property, Mark and another HOA volunteer were struggling to unload a beat-up aluminum canoe from a trailer. The canoe was painted a bright, ugly industrial orange, and bolted to its side was a cheap, plastic sign: Pinnacle Ridge, HOA Lake Patrol, keep out. Mark saw me. He waved stiffly, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He and the volunteer launched the canoe into the water, my water. This was an act of deliberate, confrontational trespass. They weren't there to fish. They were there to establish a visible, physical claim of ownership and access. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the HOA. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line. Hi, I need to report a trespasser on my property, specifically my private lake, I stated calmly. Can you give me the address and describe the individuals? The dispatcher asked. I gave them my coordinates. The individuals are in an orange canoe labeled HOA Lake Patrol. They are currently approximately 150 yards offshore in a body of water legally defined as a private non-shared resource. I have clear signage posted on my property and have already verbally warned these people. Is this a dispute with a neighbor? No, it's a dispute with a commercial entity, the local homeowners association, attempting to establish a fraudulent claim of right-of-way. I am the sole, legally recognized owner of the submerged land and the water. This is not a navigable waterway. 15 minutes later, a young deputy sheriff named Miller arrived. He was confused. He looked at my pristine property, then at the two middle-aged men paddling awkwardly in the middle of the lake in an absurd orange canoe. I walked over to Deputy Miller, handing him a laminated copy of my deed. Deputy, this section right here. I pointed to the legal description. Specifically details the metes and bounds of Lot 47, which includes the water body, Lake Serenity, in its entirety. It also explicitly states that the property is not part of the Pinnacle Ridge covenants. It is private property. Deputy Miller read it. His eyebrows rose. He pulled out his radio. He didn't call the HOA. He called his supervisor. I heard fragments of the conversation. Yes, sir, a property dispute. Involves the HOA. He has the deed for the submerged land and the water. Says it's completely private. After a minute he looked at me, then at the two men paddling closer to hear the conversation. Sir, I'm going to have to ask the two gentlemen to come to shore and leave the property immediately. This is officially being treated as a civil trespass in the third degree until the courts settle the property line. Mark and the volunteer had finally paddled within shouting distance. Deputy Mark yelled, his voice strained. We are the HOA board. This is a communal amenity. We have legal precedents to maintain the environment. Deputy Miller took a step closer to the water's edge. Sir, I'm not here to debate your CC&RS. The property owner has presented a deed that appears to show sole ownership of the body of water. Right now, you are trespassing. Bring the canoe to shore, or I will be forced to contact the Game and Wildlife Commission to impound the vessel, and I will issue you a citation. Mark's face went crimson. He started sputtering about bureaucracy and community standards, but he had lost his nerve. He and the other volunteer turned the absurd orange canoe around and paddled with furious, impotent strokes back to the municipal strip of land. They loaded the canoe onto the trailer and, without a word, sped away. I hadn't needed to say a word. The law, armed and in uniform, had spoken for me. The physical threat was gone, but the legal war was just beginning. The HOA had filed their claim and made their first aggressive, territorial move, and I had countered by immediately involving law enforcement and preparing the legal counterpunch. The lake was quiet again, but I knew the peace wouldn't last. They had drawn a line in the sand, and I had just erased it with the full weight of my deed. The next move would be James's, and it was going to be a masterpiece of legal clarity designed to send Carol's entire board scrambling. The sheriff's intervention had bought me a temporary moment of silence, but I knew the HOA, particularly Carol and her legal team, wouldn't take the trespass warning lying down. They saw the deputy as an overzealous minor inconvenience, not a legal precedent. My attorney, James, was their true roadblock. He executed Plan B immediately. While the HOA was still drafting their lien paperwork, James filed a declaratory judgment action with the county court. A declaratory judgment is a legal move that asks a judge to formally rule on the rights of the parties involved, before any actual damage like a lien has occurred. In layman's terms, I was asking the court to state, clearly and definitively, that I was the sole owner of Lake Serenity and that the Pinnacle Ridge HOA had zero legal jurisdiction over my property. This was a power play. It forced the HOA to stop trying to intimidate me with threats and start defending their flimsy claims in a court of law. The paper war, the response from the HOA's lawyer, a tired-sounding man named Mr. Henderson, was predictable. They filed a counterclaim, reiterating their position that the lake was a shared community amenity and that I owed them for the retroactive dues and the beautification fee. They tried to leverage the riparian rights doctrine again, claiming that since my property abutted a small corner of public land used by the HOA, the water body was effectively public adjacent and thus subject to their community governance. James was meticulous in his preparation. We gathered 3 key pieces of evidence. The original 1982 county plat map. This map, created when the subdivision was first established, clearly labeled Lot 47 my property, including the lake as an outparcel, and explicitly included a legal notation not subject to Pinnacle Ridge HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The gavel's sharp finality echoed in the courthouse long after the judge left the bench. I had one. The declaratory judgment was absolute. I was the sole owner of Lake Serenity, and the Pinnacle Ridge HOA had been legally enjoined barred from interfering with my property. Outside the courtroom, Carol didn't even look at me. She was arguing heatedly with Mr. Henderson, who kept shaking his head and pointing to the court order. It was clear the HOA board had underestimated the clarity of my deed and the legal force required to defend it. They had expected a quick, bullying win, and instead, they had been handed a total, public defeat. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Within days, the official ruling was posted on the county website. For the residents of Pinnacle Ridge, the lake which they had just started viewing as a potential new amenity thanks to my work was now firmly and legally out of bounds. The HOA's humiliating loss meant they had zero rights to the water, which was now legally classified as a private non-shared resource. But losing the legal battle didn't mean they were ready to surrender the war of petty grievances. The final retaliation, Carol and the board, stripped of their legal power, resorted to the only weapons they had left: neighborhood rules and passive aggression. About a week after the ruling, I received a thick manila envelope from the HOA. It wasn't a demand for dues. It was a series of violation notices regarding my surrounding land. The notices were absurd. Violation 4. A. Unauthorized external lighting. The solar-powered LED floodlights I had placed on my dock for safety were deemed excessively bright and allegedly cast light pollution onto HOA properties, violating a rule I wasn't even subject to. Violation 6. C. Unapproved perimeter barrier. They were citing the 3-strand wire fence I had installed to keep deer out of my garden as an unapproved perimeter barrier, claiming it looked unsightly from the public walking trail which runs parallel to my property line. Violation 7D. Non-conforming landscaping. They had the gall to cite the naturalized native plants I had introduced along the lakeside to prevent erosion, claiming they did not conform to the manicured aesthetic standards of the community. These fines were all completely irrelevant since my property was judicially exempt from their covenants. I called James immediately, furious. "They're just trying to harass you, Alex," James explained patiently. "They know the court ruling is final, but they can't handle the humiliation. This is their way of saving face with their members and exhausting your patience. Can they actually fine me? No. We will file a motion for contempt of court if they try to file a lien based on these new fines. But we can do something easier first. Since the judge issued a permanent injunction, any further harassment related to asserting HOA authority over your property can be addressed immediately. We're going to send them one final, devastating letter." The shutdown letter. James drafted a letter on his most intimidating letterhead, addressed directly to the HOA board, with a copy sent to the judge's clerk. The letter didn't argue the points. It simply referenced the court order and issued a direct ultimatum. The core message was, any attempt by the Pinnacle Ridge HOA to enforce its CC&ERs, impose fines, or otherwise assert jurisdiction over Lot 47 Lake Serenity, or the property owner Mr. Alex, is in direct and willful violation of the court's permanent injunction issued on date of ruling. Continued action of this nature will be interpreted as contempt of court, punishable by significant financial penalties, and potentially personal liability for the board members involved. It was a legal atomic bomb. It shifted the stakes from a petty property dispute to a serious violation of a direct court order, threatening the HOA's finances and the personal assets of Carol, Mark, and Susan. The true resolution, the silence that followed the receipt of that letter, was profound. The fines stopped. The threatening emails ceased. The black SUV was never seen near my property again. The HOA, realizing they had nowhere left to run, finally retreated entirely. They had tried to steal an asset they hadn't valued until it was pristine, been soundly defeated in court, and then been threatened with personal legal ruin for their subsequent petty actions. Life returned to a beautiful, hard-earned tranquility. The lake continued to thrive. My garden grew. I would often see the Pinnacle Ridge residents walking the public trail, their eyes lingering on the water. They no longer pointed in admiration. They gazed with the distant longing of people looking at something they had lost, or rather, something their incompetent HOA had guaranteed they would never possess. I never heard directly from Carol again, but I heard a rumor that she was facing a recall petition from the community members who were furious about the legal fees the HOA had incurred for a fight they were destined to lose, resulting in the permanent loss of a beautiful lake they now couldn't even look at without being reminded of their failure. My restoration project was complete. The legal battle was won. Lake Serenity was mine, a private, peaceful sanctuary, protected not just by the deed in my safe, but by the highest authority in the county. The HOA had come demanding dues for their lake. I left them with nothing but a huge legal bill and a view of a beautiful body of water they were forbidden to touch. The satisfaction wasn't in the win itself, but in the permanent peace that followed. The sun sets over Lake Serenity every evening, painting the water in brilliant hues of orange and gold. And no matter how beautiful the view, I am the only one who can step out onto the dock, cast a line, and truly enjoy my lake.